Esenlik toplantımızda bulunanların üzerine olsun. Haberi olup gelemeyenlere selam olsun. Habersiz olanlara tez vakitte haber ulaşsın. Uluslararası Kenan Rifai Sempozyumu'nun son günündeyiz. Ayaklarınıza sağlık, hoş geldiniz, sefalar getirdiniz. Efendim, dün çok yoğun bir gündü. Sizleri yorduysak, ki yorduk tabii ki, hakkınızı helal edin. Sağ olun, var olun. Dünkü o yoğun sempozyumlardan sonra bugün gene sabah, pazar sabahında kalkıp geldiniz. Bu yönden de hakkınızı helal edin. Dün çok yoğundu. Gürbüz Ertürk beyefendi, abimiz, Ümmü Kenan ama o kadar yoğundu ki arkasından da fotoğraf çekimi derken biz o Cemal Nur abla söz olarak anlattı ama görmek lazım. Onlar filme de kaydedildi. O çatının çekilişi filmi. O yüzden çok önemli. Şimdi o filmi izleyeceğiz. Daha sonra oturumlara başlayacağız. Efendim, hocamızın, efendimin 3 evladı vardı. İlk eşinden olan Kazım Büyükaksoy. Hani o güzel sesini dinledik. O kadar güzel ki onu isteyenler dernekten temin edebilirler. Onun çok güzel sesi var. Ben evde hoş geldin diye bir ilahisini dinliyorum. Sesi duyamıyorum. Benim sesimi. Peki. Peki efendim. Çok sevdiği eşi Lütfiye anneden olan kızı Aliye hanımefendi var. Bir de Güzide hanımefendiden olan Kainat Büyükaksoy hanımefendi var. Dün onun da o güzel sesini dinledik. Ne güzel idi. Değil mi? Birbirimize bakıyoruz, hep güzellikler görüyoruz çok şükür ama Kainat hanımefendi de ayrı bir güzeldi. Ayrı bir güzel idi. Yani konakta ben Kainat teyzeyi görmek için de gidiyordum konağa. Onun da belli etmeden bana da bir düşkünlüğü varmış. Sonradan sağ olsun bunu Nokta Nur'dan öğreniyorum. Benim hayatımla ilgili de özel olarak böyle bir sorular, sorgular ediyor imiş. Onu bilmiyordum, ben onun güzelliğine tutkundum. Efendim, bugün aile
beauty. Today, where the family lives, where Kainat teyze lived, and that mentioned part of that residence, the rooms, the quarters of her and her mother were rebuilt by the parents, and yesterday our brother Gürbüz had told us so nicely the Ümmü Kenan dergah had also been renovated, and the daughter Aliye from the Lütfiye spouse belonged to their parents, and this dergah has been purchased as the property of Cenan Foundation, and this was a very, very good mansion, and it was a very nice place. I don't know if the person was just a worker or a person who was in charge. Also, of course, the Ihvan, the brotherhood, also had much effort and contribution in that, and like our brother Gürbüz has told us, it really had a major contribution.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Tebârekellezî biyedihil mülk ve huve alâ kulli şeyin kadir. الذي خلق الموت والحياة ليبلوكم أيكم أحسن عملا وهو العزيز الغفور الذي خلق سبع سماوات طباقا ما ترى في خلق الرحمن من تفاوت فارجع البصر هل ترى من فتور ثم ارجع البصر كرتين ينقلب إليك البصر خاسئا
Sevdim seni ben mabuduma Canan diye sevdim Bir ben değil alem sana hayran diye sevdim. Bir ben değil alem sana hayran diye sevdim.
I could not be content with this, even if I listened to this, watched this time after time after time. And the word is from him again. The worldly life which exists made friends with who that he later did not throw away. To whom it has given anything that he hasn't taken back and left the person with an empty hand. Who has it not immersed into pleasure and then later given wrath and sorrow? And you can all understand this. This will not be a way or a distant issue. You think you are in Yemen, but you are here. You think you are here, but you are away. If you cannot find your truth in here, and if you leave, you will see more than your current redemption. And you will say, oh, my beloved was there. Why have I come here? You will ask to yourself. So we need to realize how important the life that we live in is. That world is very important, and it is not a place of torture only. Our chair of the first session today is Professor Dr. Turan Koç, and our members for this session are Assistant Professor, Associate Professor Dr. Mohammad. Rustom's presentation will be given by Umut Safi since he couldn't make it. And our second presenter is Professor Dr. James Winston Morris, and he will talk about Kenan Rifai as teacher, insights from his lessons on Rumi's Mesnevî.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ben bahçeler dolusu selam.
With the name of God Almighty, first of all, I'd like to greet you, starting with our Prophet Muhammad, with the Ahl Bayt, with the disciples, the Ashab, all of the ancestors that have come up today, the front, the behind, the below, the above, the living and the dead. We greet them all, and thus I will be opening the fifth session of our symposium. I'm a little bit excited, I'm a little bit emotional, and I will give you a couple of words about this. Our dear speaker said you can be close when far away, and you can be far away when you are near, and reminded me this Persian verses. And I have said, yes, come, let me share the suffering of my heart to you. But once you have arrived, the suffering has left me. So what do I have to tell you? So in that experience of rejoicing, of course there is the word, but in this official symposium, we were forced to talk, and the predecessors and me and the others are forced to talk, because we are nothing but the word itself as human beings. So today's topic made me feel emotional, that forces me to say a couple of words. In Kitab al-Cemal of Ibn Arabi, a thin book, and he says this in his book. I think it actually overlaps with all the topics of our symposium and more correlated with our topic today. No verse in the book of God Almighty and no word in existence, so every one of us, that is, the stones, the clouds, the trees, and us, we are all a word. And they have an affinity for us, an appreciation, and there is a Kemal, a Cemal, and the Celal dimension to that. And this Cemal, Kemal, and Celal trilogy always is a reflection of appreciation to us, and we have an appreciation to them. So using our conscientiousness, we perceive, we understand, we learn, and we imagine based on that mutual appreciation. And our training, our education, and our attitudes are also directly related with this. Tasawwuf is not about something only made up of words. It is a perception of existence. It is an experience of being in a conjunction of time and place, and this being reflected and expressed. So this experience, first of all, includes the awareness, the pleasure, the understanding of the presence in front of the God Almighty. This education thing is an important issue. I'd like to also quote Ibn Arabi again. Among the closest beings to God, he names the earth and the stones, and then he says are the plants, level by level, and then animals, and then the human beings. When we were meant to be the closest, knowing all the Esma of God, and especially as the human being is the one which reflects more of the Esma of God, even though we were meant to be the closest, we are unfortunately those who stay away at the furthest. So we are faced with the challenge of falling way behind from that closeness. And also some of the Western thinkers have explanations for that, which I will not get into the details. But when we talk of tasawwuf, it's meant to bring us closer to taqwa. Taqwa is not the fear of God. It is the fear of being away from that experience of closeness to God. Our experience today is very different today, and there is a traditional educational system that we have today, and especially in the tekke, dergah, and bargah, the leaders that we have, including Kenan Rifai Hazretleri as the last link, one of the gold links of that chain. Among those leaders, there is a difference somewhere. I want to share something like an anecdote. In the West, somebody goes to a priest and says, "Oh dear priest, I've lost everything I have. I'm in a terrible position." And the priest listens to him, and then he says, "Listen to that book. Read that book," the priest says. "I've read the book and I've thrown it away. It says nothing to me," he said. "Okay then, go to that one person. He will be a remedy to your suffering." And then he says, "No, I have gone to that person. I have visited him, but he was nothing. He is of no good for me." "Oh, okay, then I think your problem is much bigger than what I've thought," the priest said. And he said, "That certain person has written 2 volumes of a work, and read his books. That is your remedy," he says. And he says, "I am the person who wrote those 2 volumes, dear priest," he says. And in another anecdote, one Murshid goes to the river and he says, "You're gonna say, 'Ya Sheikh,' and you will walk through the river," he says. "You don't even need to get your pants folded up." And he says that when he reaches to the river, he says, "Keep your heart correct and I will make you cross the river." So what we say, tasawwuf or dergah or bargah, is that understanding of this mutual coexistence, and bringing that mutual coexistence come together in front of the existence of God, which is a work of adab. Adab is very important, since our Prophet Muhammad says it is very important, and that I believe should be tasawwuf as well. And here the first speech here is about education, about knowledge, about irfan, to keep our consciousness awake and to increase our field of perception. I will now give the first word to Mohammad Rustom, but he is not with us, unfortunately. So Mr. Ümit Safi will be giving his presentation. First of all, I'd like to welcome him, who will give a speech about motionless motion, which is a very striking topic in itself. And now the podium is yours, sir.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. It's a wonderful honor to have the chance to share the words of our dear friend Mohammad Rustom with you. And in the words of Nasruddin Hoja, please accept my rendition of his speech as the soup of the soup of the soup. And inshallah, it's from the same source. So our friend Muhammad starts out by saying, "Allow me to begin by thanking my dear teacher and friend Cemal Nur Hoca, as well as all of our friends at Turked, for organizing this conference on so illustrious a Sufi figure of the past century, and someone, of course, to whose spiritual lineage Cemal Nur herself belongs. I'd like to also extend my sincere apologies for not being physically present for reasons beyond my control. Nevertheless, I've had the opportunity to receive a copy of the wonderful booklet that accompanies the conference program and contains so many stunning photos of the great Kenan Rifai. Looking at them and seeing his different states in each photograph has truly been a great blessing. No less a blessing has it been to sit with his profound commentary upon Book 1 of Mevlânâ'n's Masnawi. Spending time with this book has led me to Kenan Rifai's explanation of a famous tale in the Masnawi centered around our master Ali ibn Abi Talib. The tale is retold from Islamic tradition, and like every other story in the Masnawi, is cast in Mevlânâ's unique terms and worldview. The long and short of this story is as follows. In the heat of a one-on-one encounter with an enemy of Islam, Ali gained the upper hand and thrust his opponent to the ground. Just as he was about to finish him off with one blow from his sword, the enemy spat on Ali's face. When this happened, Ali immediately dropped his sword and walked away. This perplexed his enemy and led him to ask Ali in earnest why he had not killed him at that very moment. Ali then speaks, telling the enemy that he only fights for the sake of God. But when the man insulted him by spitting at him, the possibility that it would become a personal affair had presented itself to him. So he walked away from the situation. Ali then explains that he never acts out of self-interest, but only for, in, and through God. If I may add one word to what Muhammad has said, it's intriguing that Ali still experiences anger, right? Even the Insan Kamil still experiences anger, but the anger doesn't have to move you to action. And that seems to be one of the marks of the perfected human being. In Kenan Rifai's explanation of this account, it is clear that he understands the exact meaning of this story both by way of learning and by way of experience, that is, zawq, or tasting. Indeed, as the ancient doctrine tells us, only the like can know the like. And there's no doubt that Kenan Rifai and Hazrat Mevlânâ were kindred spirits. Two passages from Kenan Rifai's commentary on this tale of the Masnawi shall suffice as evidence. In both instances, Rifâî explains Ali's words in the first person. He says, "In reality, I am not I. I'm one of those who's attained the degree of annihilation of his soul in the path of God. For me, there is no other being, including myself, other than God. The power and invincibility of my sword is not due to my skill. It's not my sword, it's God's sword. And that is why I use God's sword only for those purposes God wishes. I bear no resentment towards anyone, nor have I any hidden self-interest. I am free of that malady special to mankind." This means that you're talking with a free spirit. You are hearing his testimony, and as you know, the testimony of people who are not free or prisoners or slaves, especially if they are slaves to their own souls, is not worth 2 grains of barley. The implications of these noble words are very clear. Only when we act without self-interest and egoism are our actions worthy in the sight of Allah. In other words, real action in the world is commensurate to the degree to which we relinquish our own self-contrivance, tadbir, and allow God to do his work. We thus act by giving up the illusory sense of self that gives us a false notion of our agency in our actions. To put it differently, we truly act when God is the actor and not ourselves. This then explains the title of my lecture, Actionless Action, which incidentally also refers to a famous Taoist doctrine, namely that of Wu Wei, or acting without acting. The Quranic basis for this position, which Mevlânâ also cites in the story in question, is Quran Surah 8, Ayah 17, where God tells the Prophet that the Prophet did not throw the dust at the Quraysh at the Battle of Badr, when he threw it. Rather, that it was God who threw the dust. At this point, I'd like to shift the focus of my lecture and take the teachings being discussed here in a seemingly different, though in reality intimately related direction. One of the things that stands out in Mevlânâ's retelling of the story and Kenan Rifai's commentary upon it is their emphasis on the degree of detachment from any ulterior motive and worldly gain that characterizes the soul of the person who subsists in God, al-Baghi billah. This then leads to a deep respect for the other, even at one of the most intense moments of human experience, namely war. If I may pause here for a second, at that moment in the Masnawi, Ali actually addresses the other warrior as a muhtasham, and he calls the warrior by his own name, Ali. He says, how can this Ali kill Ali? He sees his own humanity present in the other person. That, I think, is what our friend is referring to. Pondering about this idea has led me to inquire into an additional other which we as human beings face every day of our lives and which we constantly harm on the account of precisely our own selfish desires and ego-centered aims and aspirations. The other I have in mind here is the environment. What follows, therefore, is an exposition of the environmental crisis based on the same perspectives which Mevlânâ and Kenan Rifai have explained in the meaning of Ali's action, or shall I say, his actionless actions. An important point to keep in mind here is that one of the words in Arabic for the environment is muhit, namely that which surrounds or encompasses something. Interestingly, in the Quran, God himself figures as the surrounder or encompasser. Thus, God is our environment because he surrounds us. Such a standpoint lends full support to the idea that nature is sacred. That is, the environment is nothing other than where God is to be found, but in his manifold modes of manifestation and not as he is in himself. Let us also call attention to a key Quranic theme, namely the khilafah, the custodianship given to the human beings over nature. It's figured in such Quranic passages as, "Have you not considered that God has made whatsoever is on the earth subservient unto you? And have you not considered that God has made whatsoever is in the heavens and whatsoever is on the earth subservient unto you, and has poured his blessing unto you, both outwardly and inwardly?" Human beings, who are the custodians of nature, have become as obscure as the very environment which houses them. This is because the balance and equilibrium with their natural surroundings have been thrown off thanks to our own actions. The Quran alludes to this very phenomena. Corruption has appeared on land and the sea because of what men's hands have earned, so that God may let them taste some of that which they've done. Hopefully, they might return. Yet this verse also implies a sense of hope, as it seems to indicate that if people are given a small window into the kinds of catastrophes against nature that we ourselves have initiated, it's possible that we will take heed, change our ways, and return to God. One of the surest ways people can begin to rectify their distance from an obscure relationship to nature is first by coming to understand themselves. This will only happen when they awaken from their state of being blind and subsequently read the signs on the horizon and deep within. I am here, of course, alluding to a well-known Quranic verse which sets up the basic picture of the human-nature relationship. سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ وَفِي أَنفُسِهِمْ حَتَّى يَتَبَيَّنَ لَهُمْ إِنَّهُ الْحَقِّ. We, God, shall show them our signs, our ayat, on the horizons and inside their own souls, until it becomes clear to them that God is real, God is the truth. Thus, the more we come to know of ourselves, the more we come to know the book of nature, namely the cosmos. The more we come to know the book of nature, the more we come to know ourselves. Again, just in a short departure, in this verse what we're told is that there are three sites that we are to find Allah: within the verses of Scripture, within the natural cosmos, and inside our own souls. When these three come together, that is when God becomes real. At the same time, if we remain ignorant of our true state, if we consume nature by devouring, our souls will become distant from God. In Islamic metaphysical teachings, the closer we are to our transcendent source, the more we're characterized by luminosity, subtlety, and spirituality. On the other hand, the further we are from our source, the more we're characterized by darkness, density, and materiality. That's to say, the more realized we become in the signs that lead us back to God, the more intense is our awareness in accordance with our ascent, in the levels of being, which is greater by nature, proceeding from the most intense and undifferentiated to least intense and most differentiated. The further we fall from God's signs, the less aware we become. Put differently, the more dense we become, the more heavy our nature, the less likely we are to participate in the higher modes of awareness. It's already been seen that humans are the custodians of nature. But why was this trust placed on our shoulders? The answer is alluded to in the Quran, where God tells the angels that he will place a vicegerent, a khalifa, on earth. A vicegerent is technically someone who stands in the place of another, carrying out the function that has been assigned to her. Thus, on earth, human beings are God's representative, meaning that they are to carry out the charge and duty of God's will. Yet if the treatment of nature today is any measure of our success in being God's vicegerents on earth, then we are certainly doing a very poor job. This is why any talk in Islamic thought of people as God's vicegerents really refers to their being the potential vicegerents of God on earth. How then does one realize this vicegerency? It has everything to do with the assumption of divine qualities. This statement is in accordance with the famous prophetic injunction to take on the character traits of God. تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ. Every virtue that a human being can take on is only a possibility because that virtue already belongs to God in its full actuality and goodness. Thus, human beings can, to the measure allowed by the human condition, only be merciful in imitation of the all-merciful, Ar-Rahman, and can only be loving in imitation of the lover, Al-Wadud. This teaching has some very important implications for the ontological roots of ethical categories. But the main point to come away with at this junction is that the Muslims of the past have seen the human project as a totally worthwhile one, only insofar as human beings attempt to conform to the divine norm. As for where these qualities are, the Sufis tell us that they're already contained within the human being, in accordance with the saying of the Prophet to the effect that God created Adam in his own form. One key insight to be gleaned from this teaching in the context of the human relationship to nature is that whereas in us the divine names are undifferentiated, in the cosmic order, which discloses God qua manifestation, they're also to be found, but in a differentiated manner. Thus, if we are merely content to consume, then this act of squandering our own selves and the natural environment will result in our inability to actualize the divine qualities potentially contained within ourselves and within nature, resulting in an even greater divide between us and the natural world. Now, it can be asked why human beings have the potential to actually harm nature. Why not simply be created in a way that this harmonious balance would always exist, and everyone could then be God's vicegerent on earth? The answer has to do with God's divine qualities that are already configured in human beings. Since one of God's qualities is will, human beings who derive their positive qualities from God's positive qualities must have the real freedom to choose things for themselves. This can lead to an ever-increasing view of things in which subject and object are seen as distinct. Such a view can result in a highly reified and overly scienticized vision of things that pushes the world into the realm of pure exigency and human control, thus further widening the gap between subject and object. This results in the inconsequentialist view of nature, where the harm done to the object out there is not seen in any real way affecting the subject in here. If we take on the divine qualities, we will simply be bidding our own nature. And to the extent that this happens, the world of nature, being the same as ourselves, will also be brought into harmony with the divine order. Those who realize this teaching can see nature with crystal clarity, since the subject and object dichotomy, which characterizes the usual human interaction with the natural world, is nothing but illusion, characterized, as are all things, by the veil of forms which surround them. For the self-realized person, the divine qualities to be found within the cosmos are brought about in an undifferentiated form, and this parallels the actualized undifferentiated form of the divine qualities that are already configured in her own soul. We call this sympathy with nature. There's a saying of the Prophet to the effect that the believer is the mirror of the believer. This is normally understood to mean that what a Muslim sees of the good or bad in his brother or sister is also a reflection of what is in himself or herself. Yet, as has been pointed out by Ibn Arabi and others, believer is also a name of God, al-Mu'min. Since everything in the cosmos prostrates to God, each thing is in reality a believer. If the believer is a mirror of God, who is the believer? Who is the Mu'min? Then the cosmos and all that it contains is a mirror of forms in which God sees himself. The Prophet has also said that God is beautiful and he loves beauty. This explains why the cosmos is beautiful, because it is a mirror of divine beauty. The teaching that God's face, which is beautiful, of course, is everywhere to be found, as in the Quran, to God belong the east and the west, whichsoever way you turn, there is the face of Allah. God is all-encompassing, all-knowing. Since God's face is everywhere, it's reflected in the mirror of the cosmos, which is nothing but a display for the traces of God's beauty. Having transcended the forms themselves, God's true vicegerents can see beyond them, moving with great ease from the symbol to the symbolized without negating the symbol as such. Rather, they see in the symbol, through the symbol, the very face of the beloved, which is beyond all space and time. This is, in some sense, what it's like to fall in love. Just as when someone falls in love, the subject-object dichotomy is prone to vanish between the lover and the beloved, especially in the act of union, so too is the case when one falls in love with the cosmos, which is nothing less than the face of God. Such a person who sees through God cannot be described as a separate I over and against the cosmic order. This person's face can be said to be God's face. The station in Sufi texts is referred to by many names, among which are union, jam, and proximity, qurb. Yet who is doing the witnessing here? Let us look again at the Quran, part of which we've already cited. We shall show them our signs on the horizons and inside their own souls until it becomes clear to them that God is the truth. Does it not suffice that your Lord is witness over all things? With respect to this last part of this verse, what is implied here is that it is God himself who sees himself in the myriad forms of creation, as these forms act as the loci for his own self-seeing. God is thus sufficient as a witness since he is the supreme witness of all things, each of which in turn testifies to his oneness and beauty. The person whose face is now God's face thus beholds God in everything, and the implications of such a person being God's vicegerent become clear. Such an individual will not harm the environment, since it is actually all witnessed as sacred to him, reflecting as it does his own face, which is nothing other than the divine face, in whose contemplation he is annihilated. There is thus nothing for him to aspire towards, no gain to receive from nature, no action to perform, since nature itself is God's gift to him. Nature thereby presents him with all that he loves, as it is the context in which God, his true beloved, is the sole agent and actor. Thank you.
We would like to thank Mr. Ümit Safi. We would like to thank Mr. Ümit Safi for reading the text one by one very clearly. Yes, we might be a little bit over time, but it was the right of the text. So what I have understood from it, all of our Sufis, all of our poets, what this article meant to say is true, I believe. And like Sheikh Ghalib, when he was writing Hüsnü Aşk, he said, I have opened this up and I have eaten it up. I have finished it up. But the last verses just tell this. It says, you writer, this work is not yours. It does not belong to you. And this is true, because if everything is a place and ground for manifestation of God's wills and doings, then it is true. Everything will be covered by God Almighty. So thank you very much. And now the word goes out to our dear friend, Mr. Morris, and he will talk about Kenan Rifai as a teacher, and based on the lessons and gains from Mevlânâ's Mesnevî.
Launching into the paper, I wanted to say a few words of thanks, not only to Cemal Nur Hoca, to all of her students and all the servants who've made this possible, but by way of thanks to all of them, I wanted to mention a kind of story about the way the light and influence of the awliya, the friends of God, sort of transcends time and moves in mysterious ways. And it has to do with the first course I ever took in the history of Sufism with a woman named, many of you would know the name, at least Anna Marie Schimmel. I'm sure, pretty sure that Karl Ernst here as well followed the same course, if not the same year, a few years later. And what was interesting about her way of teaching is that she would sort of close her eyes and recite long lists of names and technical terms and Sufis and all, and then she would open them and tell us stories. And I think at the time, I've talked to other students who've gone on to teach, we kind of thought the stories were just kind of to keep us interested and awake in the classroom. But later on we realized that the stories were the real teaching, and the other things are in this book called Mystical Dimensions of Islam, but the stories are not, of Sufis that she had known and experiences with awliya and pilgrimage and so forth. And really foremost among them, most frequent perhaps, was her mention of time she had spent with Kenan Rifai and with Samia Ayaverdi, who was more of Dr. Schimmel's exact generation and time. So it's wonderful opportunity and strange workings of Providence to come back here and watch all of these stories, which seem very far away at the time, come back to life in this setting as we visit his home and grave and see all these photos and members of the family and so forth. So thank you for making that possible. I usually begin papers with a little ayah from the Quran, which summarizes everything that's likely to be found therein. I didn't do that with this paper, but those of you who visited Merkaz Effendi 2 days ago and on Jummah on Friday will remember surely the wonderful recitation of the Quran at his grave of an ayah, that verse that I've seen on walls and heard recited everywhere from Morocco to Indonesia. It's a favorite of Sufis. I'll start actually with the translation because we don't have it in the paper, and then I'll just do a little bit of the Arabic at the actual Quran at the end. But it reminds us of something that we've just heard about. It says, there has already come to all of you a messenger. One who needs to be a little, okay, is that better? A messenger from your own souls, from your own selves, deeply concerned with whatever troubles you, passionately devoted to you all, filled with love and compassion for those who have faith. It goes on, but those are the parts, because that messenger who comes to us from ourselves is the subject of the Masnawi and the subject of Kenan Rifai's commentary on the Masnawi. So let me just, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ. I always had this problem with reciting the Quran. رَسُولٌ مِنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عزيز عليه ما عنتم حريص عليكم بالمؤمنين رؤوف رحيم. So that was the beautifully recited verse we all heard last Friday. So now Amma Ba'd, Kenan Rifai, spiritual teacher. It's difficult to form a clear picture of such important intellectual and spiritual figure as Kenan Rifai on the basis of the few English translations of his work that is yet publicly accessible. Fortunately, Victoria Holbrook's beautifully intuitive and sensitive translation of his commentary on all of Book 1 of Rumi's Masnawi now provides an immense and wide-ranging introduction to many dimensions of Rifai's spiritual teaching. So I've naturally chosen to rely on that extensive source for this initial study. And since I've been regularly studying and teaching this opening book of Rumi's masterpiece for several decades now, the distinctive features and personal emphases of Kenan Rifai's teaching readily stand out throughout this lengthy work. I'll skip a paragraph of the paper which contrasts it with other kinds of commentaries. Let's get right to Kenan Rifai. Rifai's work remains faithful throughout to the original spiritual aims and governing intention of Rumi's masterwork, to its role as a constantly shifting mirror of our present state. So this means quoting, so usually Rifai, here it's quoting Rumi. Mevlânâ'n's spiritual Masnavi, his spiritual epic, is a work whose reading and study is an unavoidably individual task of ever-renewed discovery and recognition of insights, pitfalls, challenges, and learning experiences that it can only be revealed by its constant juxtaposition with the actual unique and highly particular realities and experiences of each reader's or student's life. Building on that necessarily individual and dynamic interrelationship with Rumi's teachings, Rifai's work constantly assumes and carefully constructs an operative context of spiritual pedagogy, of spiritual teaching, that focuses at every stage on the practically indispensable guiding and transformative spiritual role of the friends of God, the awliyaullah, the Ârânlar, the insan, the perfect human beings, and so forth. For simplicity's sake, I'll usually use the word friend here with a capital F for the wali, and all of these other terms that he uses. Given the time limits of this symposium, I would like to focus here on the remarkably subtle and effective ways that Kenan Rifai here carefully orients his students and readers towards a spiritually dynamic approach and context for their own ongoing engagement with Rumi's masterpiece. That unique work itself is beautifully constructed like its Quranic model and inspiration in such a way that each discourse only reveals its intended meanings and new lessons through active, participatory interaction with the relevant personal illustrations and real-life lessons that gradually arise in each reader's life everywhere in the world around us, as Omid and Mohammad have just reminded us. And that unfolding inner interaction, if it is to be fruitful, depends on the impetus of a lasting, persistent inner motivation of a kind of himmat. So how can a teacher or guide awaken that actively ongoing engagement? How can they bring about that illuminating dimension and far-reaching aims of this mysterious work? Kenan Rifai's response to this basic challenge involves several different emphases at different stages of Book 1, such as his stress in the central sections on the aims and proper practice of spiritual disciplines, of riyazat. But his opening orientation in the first 100 pages of this remarkable English translation, that is in Rumi's prologue and the first 3 longer stories or discourses, relies above all on a careful stage-by-stage introduction of various facets of the underlying relationship of wilayah, of divine closeness or proximity to that inner messenger in each of our souls, that is, of this intimate, ever-present divine friendship, closeness, guidance, testing, and spiritual instruction in all its infinite forms. This relationship that teachers like Rumi insist secretly informs each person's life on earth and beyond. For most readers, as we know, are likely to start their journey with only intermittent glimmers of recognition of this all-encompassing reality of divine compassion, caring, guidance, and beauty. Following Rumi's own lead, which throughout the Masnawi usually surfaces in the recurrent form of impassioned direct addresses or allusions to his own autobiographical wali figures of Shams Tabriz and Hussam ad-Din, Kenan Rifai carefully introduces at the start of his lessons some 14 essential aspects of this fundamental human-divine relationship, highlighting that ever-present metaphysical context of wilayah in ways that usually stand out boldly from the broader flow of his simple, ongoing paraphrase of Rumi's stories and teaching. Here we may also note the way that he almost always turns to a few telling lines of poetry from Yunus Emre whenever he wishes to highlight particular facets of this relationship with the wali or friend. So let us follow his own introduction to this relationship of wilayah step by step. I don't know that I can cover all 14 in the limited time available, but I'll do what I can here until the time runs out. Taking up the read of first one of Rumi's famous prologue, Rifai begins by introducing the divine friends, or arrived ones, the Turanlar, highlighting in particular the countless transformative experiences of loss and separation, the telling signs and effects of love, of the deeper metaphysical reality of our earthly situation that eventually enabled them to reach their spiritual goal. And perhaps I need to say that the important thing is we read books like this and we think this separation, this loss, this distance is something that we are kind of too dense to, we have to experience it ourselves. But what he's saying here is when we look at someone who's a friend, who's a prophet, who's a messenger, who's a famous Sufi, whatever, they've gotten there by passing through these endless experiences of suffering. His purpose, again echoing Rumi, is to awaken the transformative power of intense inner longing of niyaz in people who might be complacent as what he calls the first step of the ascending arc of the human soul's process of perfection. Next, alluding to the transformational influence of Mevlânâ's own fateful meeting with Shams of Tabriz, Rifai illustrates the illuminating role for each of us of encountering a fully human being, a perfect human in this translation, insan, as the treasured initial experience of theophany, of tajalli, of divine presence and manifestation, through which a person may first come to recognize his own spiritual substance. This is again, his words. Meeting a fully human being provides a transformative experience of theophany, of divine self-disclosure, through which a person comes to recognize his or her own divine substance. Again, his quote. Here one essential caution is in order, equally applicable to all that follows. As throughout each stage of his introduction to wilayah, his aim here is clearly to oblige the attentive reader to seek out and begin to re-examine more closely the actual range of their own previous experiences of this order, whether that be in dreams, nature, traveling, meditation, or all the other endless theaters of divine revelation. These are the essential raw materials for each succeeding stage of his initiatic journey, and without them, his readers would be immediately lost in the traditional terminology and the metaphysical, theological schemas meant to situate and clarify the role of those treasured, illuminating experiences. And third, Rifâî then moves on to point out the ways each initial theophanic encounter with a friend, a wali, together with the loss or separation that normally follows that event, readily leads us on to seek out other such fully human persons and to struggle to attain their inner states. As Rifâî puts it here, the path of the arrived, in its infinite outward forms and expressions, naturally arises from such fateful encounters. Those transformative encounters, he emphasizes, often come from within or from beyond our everyday world, as in Rumi's opening account of the lovesick king's desperate prayer and its initial answer in the imaginal dreamlike reality, khayal, that only subsequently unfolds in the events and appearances of the outside world. Fourth, like so many earlier Sufi teachers and writers, Rifâî often compresses complex spiritual insights into a single dense epigrammatic formula, as in his ensuing observation here, that spirit and being, ruh and wujud alike, varlik, are the divine beauty in itself, that they are the same, both outwardly and inwardly. Again, his purpose in doing so is not to turn his readers toward the familiar thickets of metaphysical and theological discussion, what Rumi had done before he met Shams, but rather to challenge them to recollect and re-examine their own manifold experiences and illustrations of that provocative insight. Fifthly, once that far-reaching observation has been assimilated, he notes that passionate, transforming love, ishq, ashq, is the natural response to this divine beauty, especially in the wali, a fully human being, who sees divine wisdom and beauty wherever he looks. Here Rifâî already introduces the central pedagogical role of the fully realized human being as the poetic wine pourer, the saki, whose words are artful communications in every domain of life, evoke this beauty and awaken this love in those with the necessary inner preparedness. Again, his brief opening remarks are not just pointing to history's familiar prophets, saints, and great artists. Instead, as one readily discovers in introducing the Masnawi and similar spiritual or philosophic classics to college students, it is not easy at this first encounter to get past the students' understandable obsession with their own personal, individual dimension of spiritual growth and learning. But this immense final work of Rumi is also, far more than his better-known lyrical poetry, a truly mature work intended for teaching teachers. So much so that much of Kenan Rifai's own teaching here can only be properly appreciated in that wider perspective. And indeed, many of his disciples, as we know, became great teachers and artists and communicators in their own right. So 6, building on these preceding points, Rifâî goes on to remark that fully human beings reveal wisdom and consciousness only to the prepared. For these mysteries of love are the divine trust, the amana mentioned in the Quran, as being uniquely bestowed on the human being. Here he also stresses the deeper importance of Rumi citing Plato as one of the first and foremost physicians of divine love, in Mevlânâ's words. This is one of Mevlânâ's many passages where he insists on the full human universality and the primordial nature of all these spiritual realities and corresponding teachings of the Masnawi, intimately accessible to all human beings as such. The experienced teachers stress here already on the pedagogical need for proper individual preparedness and contextual wisdom in order to receive and then appropriately convey higher spiritual teaching and unveiling, is of course more fully developed in his remarks on Rumi's account of the Zayd and the Prophet near the end of Book 1. 7. One of Kenan Rifai's more poignant observations here is his comment that each soul's purification depends on that person's love for those divine friends who fully reflect God's beauty. Implicitly, this remark points the way to those intimations of beauty, points the way that these intimations of beauty underlie our growing awareness of the ever deeper presence and activity of the friends as guides and teachers. However, this primordial dimension of wilaya is something that we can only discover through actual experience of the phenomenon in question, which initially appear fragmentary, discontinuous, or even apparently absent for some people. Just trying to figure out one more. I'll say a little bit about what he says about the story of the doctor and the handmaiden. In discussing the role of the Shams-like doctor of souls in the famous opening story of the Masnawi, Kenan Rifai focuses directly on some key features of the distinctive art of the spiritual guide or physician. Here he mentions Hakim, a wise person. Here he mentions specifically finding the deeper roots of our own inner weak spots and defects of character, of always preserving our hope and motivation, and of strictly respecting the inherent secrets and mysteries of the path. As one example of such secrets, he had just emphasized a few pages earlier that the most comprehensive metaphysical realities, things such as the workings of the divine spirit, the cosmic intelligence, or Mohammedan reality, or even the divine sun, Shams, these things can't be effectively or described or usefully spoken of except to the true spiritual knowers, the Urafā, and the arrived ones. And a few pages later, in the same story still, he mentions one of the most palpable and commonly experienced of features of our encounters with a friend or wali, already emphasized in so many earlier classics of Islamic spiritual literature. That is the way the focused attention or spiritual gaze, the nazar of the wali or the arrived one, transforms someone who believes in him, thereby restraining the carnal impulse of the soul and helping that person to sense and awaken to true love while more readily recognizing and assimilating life's unfolding lessons. And I'll just say, skipping one, moving on to 11, in the famous short tale of the parrot and the similarly bald Kalender dervish, and in much greater detail in the long following story of the evil king and his crafty, destructive, and cunning missionary vizier, Rifai turns to what is perhaps the most unavoidable and recurrent practical question involving the relationship of wilaya. On the outward plane, how can we discern misguided, self-deluded, and often unknowingly ignorant claimants to spiritual authority and guidance from the genuine divine friends and their sound guidance and instruction? And more inwardly, how can we avoid ourselves all the temptations of unconscious spiritual hypocrisy and self-delusion by the subtle idols of our own creation, exemplified here in the bountiful persuasive gifts of the satanic vizier? Fortunately, of course, Rifai notes that the only way to acquire truth is to know and serve the divine friends. But this painful story is full of relevant warnings, as with the scrolls of 12 spiritual partial truths that this evil vizier so persuasively proclaims as the whole truth to each warring sect. You can find those scrolls in any self-help section of any bookstore. The mysterious symbolic events of this second discourse in the Masnawi clearly allude to the bloody intra-Muslim civil wars, the Fitan, that so memorably mark the era immediately after the Prophet's death, not to mention our own very dramatic contemporary examples of Fitan. And they even more dramatically reflect the tragic disruptions involving Rumi's rebellious older son and disciples following the arrival of Shams. Yet the familiarity of such endlessly recurring outward illustrations only reflects more pervasive, unavoidable inner struggles and learning experiences that are Mevlânâ's real subject here. To skip over the remaining lessons in these stories, to come to a conclusion. From this point on, after the third discourse, the one about the evil king and the fires, from this point on, beginning with the famous fable of the lion and the brave, wise hare, Rumi's pedagogical focus and Kenan Rifai's corresponding emphasis turns from the initial challenge of spiritual awakening and recognition to the ongoing, more lasting demands of realization and practical enactment. From the paramount task of finding, discerning, and recognizing the constant guiding presence of the wali, of the Rasul, all the hidden providential workings of the friends, he here moves on to the more practical daily individual struggles of overcoming, or better, of integrating all the inner obstacles and distractions that stand in the way of our actively fulfilling the friends' promptings and appropriately responding to their calls. From here on to the end of Book 1, each tale has its own key protagonist silently persevering and quietly heroic, even in the exemplary concluding story of Ali, who represents the mature presence and inspiration of the divine friends of all those arrived and fully human actors, whose lessons and examples still invite each reader's freely loving and creative response. Following their thread, Rifâî suggests in the remainder of these richly insightful lessons in Book 1, already makes clear to the student why, at the very end of Mevlânâ'n's immense spiritual epic, and the difficult, long concluding tale of the three brothers at the end of Book 6, it is the paradoxical laziness of patient, unflagging, and ever-attentive devotion, of sabr and true ibadah mukhlisa, that eventually wins the prize, bringing to its full intended fruitful fulfillment all of life's more outwardly dramatic tales of passionate love and the hard-won lessons of knowledge and awareness. Thank you.
Profesör Morris'e çok teşekkürler ediyoruz.
We would like to thank Professor Morris. His article was really long, and I hope we will have the chance of reading the totality of the text and benefit from it. It's actually a very important subject. Kenan Rifai Hazretleri and his predecessors and the leaders and guides, what they have done was to bring us together with our essence, with our core, to make us rejoice with our own self. And with Mevlânâ's Mesnevî and Divan and Mecalis-i Sabah, as we can see, brings us together with our tradition, as well as being a guide for bringing us together with our education and tradition and with our roots. So as of now, we have completed the 5th session and hoping to see you back again. Greetings.
Efendim 20 dakikalık bir aramız var.
We're going to have a break for 20 minutes.
Alalım.